Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, 2 patients have died at a Worcestershire hospital after waiting for a bed. The deaths have thrown a spotlight on the pressures in the NHS, with research revealing that a third of hospital trusts in England issued warnings about patient numbers last month. Some have called in the Red Cross to deal with what's been described as a humanitarian crisis. Paul McNamara now reports.
It's become as expected at winter as the morning frost, an annual A&E crisis. And this year, it's hit sooner and harder than ever before. Record numbers of overstretched hospitals have had to shut their doors to emergencies. At Worcestershire Royal Hospital this week, a woman died of a heart attack on an A&E trolley after allegedly waiting 35 hours for a ward bed. Another patient suffered an aneurysm and later died in a resuscitation bay, again allegedly after a lengthy wait. The hospital are investigating the cases and wouldn't comment on the issues surrounding them, but admitted extreme numbers causing continued pressure and patient delays. They added they have robust plans to deal with such demand. That demand, though, is not unique according to new figures released today. A&E departments across the country were forced to shut their doors to patients more than 140 times last month. That's a rise of 63% on the same period the year before. And during Christmas week alone, hospitals across England had to refuse emergencies, sending them elsewhere 42 times. That's the highest on record. Many have taken to social media pleading with patients to stay away unless their condition is a genuine medical emergency. Some hospitals, desperate to keep their doors open, have had to find extra beds. This hospital scrambled to find dozens last week.
6 of the 7 days last week between Christmas and New Year's Day, every single bed here at the North Middlesex Hospital was being used. That's 484 beds, all fully occupied. But as today's figures show, this isn't a problem isolated to just this one hospital. And according to the experts, it's not a problem isolated to just one cause either.
Some reasons are medical. An increase this year in norovirus, for example, requiring thousands of beds to be closed. But some reasons are systemic.
What we're seeing from these statistics is growing pressure, particularly on hospitals and accident and emergency departments. Demand is up from last year by over 3%, we think, and admission to hospital is also going up, and it's getting harder to get the patients out. The number of people waiting to be transferred to a nursing home or to home care is also going up. So it's just a general picture of increasing pressure.
But there is a longer-term issue. Right. A longer-term issue.
It's a general picture ignored by previous governments, according to the Prime Minister.
They've ducked this issue, which is about how do we ensure we've got a sustainable system of social care going into the future. Right.
A complete review of social care has now been demanded by the chairs of 3 common select committees today. Their sentiment apparently backed up by the Red Cross, who say they've had to step in to help ambulance trusts because of cuts to social care. It's been a tough Christmas for hospitals, but here's a warning for the future. Traditionally, the worst weeks are the end of January and the beginning of February. This may be a very long winter indeed.
Well, we did ask the Department of Health to speak to us. They responded by saying this was an operational matter and referred us to NHS England. They said no one was available and issued a statement saying that plans remain in place to deal with additional pressure in the winter. But I am joined now by Chris Hopson, who's Chief Executive of NHS Providers, which represents hospital trusts. Let me ask you first how much pressure you think the NHS is under. I mean, is this a winter crisis?
Well, there are 3 things we know. The first is that the demand that our hospitals and other trusts are experiencing is greater than it's ever been before. So on the 27th of December, we had 65,000 people attending A&E departments. That's a record. Some of our members are saying 20 to 30% year-on-year increases. The second thing that we know is that by and large, and there's an important qualification in the by and large, actually we're tending to deal with that pressure pretty well. So we tend to measure the pressure in three different ways. The real pressure, trolley weights in terms of people waiting in trolleys and corridors. We measure it by how many people having to wait more than 12 hours. And we also measure it by the capacity inside hospitals. And what we're basically saying is that by and large, we're dealing with it satisfactorily.
Well, that's odd that you... Well, let me just jump in there, though, because it's odd that you say that, because record numbers of A&Es are diverting patients to other hospitals, shutting their doors to patients in Christmas week, for example. A third of English hospital trusts have warned that they needed to take urgent action to cope in December. And you're kind of saying crisis what crisis?
No, I'm not saying crisis what crisis. The third bit, which is, if I'd had the chance to say it, was effectively is we do know that in certain hospitals, a small number, they are really, really struggling to cope with that demand.
Is that poor management?
No, and we've seen in a number of different news stories that have been appearing today the results of that pressure. The bit that I think is really important is let's not mix up two things. The first is the fact that in a small number of areas, we are under real pressure, with an implication that you hear in a number of other places that somehow that's a true picture of the system as a whole, because that's not the case. Thanks to the incredibly hard work of over 1 million NHS staff, actually, we're doing slightly better than last year. But I'd be the first to acknowledge the system is under greater pressure than it's ever been, and I'd also be very ready to acknowledge that in a small number of places, we have got a real problem.
A lot of this, hospitals say, is down to social care and problems with funding in social care. Now, the government's moved to address that by saying that councils will be able to increase council tax to address social care funding problems. Is that going to be enough to avoid the kind of problems we're seeing at what you say is a small number of hospitals?
Well, I think we all recognise there is a significant problem with social care. We recognise the fact that the government did allow councils to raise more money, but we would agree with their representative organisation, the Local Government Association, that said very clearly it's not a sustainable long-term answer. And we would absolutely echo the 3 select committee chairs today who wrote to the Prime Minister to say we still have to find a long-term sustainable answer to social care, because we haven't got one.
Well, it's funny because back in 2015, you described the extra £10 billion that the government found for the NHS. You personally said that was a good settlement for the NHS. Do you, in retrospect, think you should have protested it wasn't enough?
So you need to make 2 comparisons. The first comparison with what was going on with the rest of public services. And if you look back to 2015, the NHS, compared to all other public services, did receive an increase that was larger than any other public service. So in that respect, it was a welcome extra amount of money. However, if you make the comparison to the need, so health care and demand goes up by, cost and demand goes up by 1%, by 4% every year, and the funding's only going up by 1% a year. And if you also make the long-term comparison, again, since 1948 to 2010, the NHS received average increases of 3.5% a year, but we're now only receiving 1% a year.
So given that...
So for that reason, actually, it's not enough, and we did say that at the time as well.
OK, so given that, is it time for some political honesty here, that in order for the NHS to cope in the future, there needs to be something else, more funding, higher taxes to pay for it, for example?
So what's going on underlying all of this, which seems to us to be really important, is we are in the middle of, so actually at the beginning of, a big demographic bulge where we've got a whole bunch of people, the baby boom that came after the Second World War, where we've got a whole large number of people who are reaching the age where they're going to need more health and care services. And we're at the very beginning of that bulge, and we are really struggling to meet it. So if we're struggling now, what's it going to be like when we hit the middle of that bulge? So there's a
higher taxes to pay for
So
it?
there's a fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves as a nation, which is what quality of healthcare do we need and social care do we need? And the answer is, if you look at that bulge that is coming, we are going to have to spend more or suffer worse services. And that is the key question that, to be frank, nobody is really properly grappling with. And we have to have our politicians, and we have to, as a nation, have a proper debate about that.
You favour higher taxes?
Well, so clearly all of us in the NHS would say we want to carry on providing absolutely outstanding care to the extra numbers of people that are going to be, because of that bulge, requiring that care. So yes, more money.
More money through tax?
Well, so I think more money through taxation. Can I just add one other very important point, just to go back to the bit we were doing before,
Briefly,
which is that There's one thing that your viewers can do to help, which is accident and emergency departments are there for genuine accident and emergencies. So could I please ask that anybody who effectively, before you go to A&E, could you please think very carefully before you do so? Please ring 111 first or go and see your local GP. Only use an A&E department for what it says on the tin for accident and emergency.
Chris Hobson, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, another winter, another crisis for the NHS, but the trouble is they seem to get worse every year. According to the latest figures, NHS hospitals in England are under pressure like never before. Last month, A&E departments had to close to new patients more than 100 times because they simply couldn't cope. A third of all English hospital trusts triggered official alerts because of the sheer pressure on their resources. It all paints a picture of a service close to breaking point.
They're geared to deal with our emergencies, but now A&Es across England are so full, dozens are declaring their own. Winter demand forcing them to close their doors to focus on patients already inside. Last week, hospitals like Colchester turned away record numbers. With no beds spare at all, patients here were already sitting in corridors before they closed the A&E to new arrivals.
So certainly the past couple of weeks have been the worst that I've seen in terms of the holiday period and the post-holiday period in hospitals and indeed right across the system. So we're seeing increased pressure in primary care, ambulance, social care, community care, but also most crucially for me, the hospitals. It's as bad as it's ever been.
In total, the latest figures show A&E departments in England closed 143 times to new patients in December, up 63% on the previous year. While out of 152 hospital trusts, 55 issued alerts and had to take urgent action to cope with demand. And in the worst cases, 8 were unable to give patients comprehensive care.
Our departments are overcrowded to a state where patients who normally would transition up to a medical ward in 4 to 6 hours are now waiting 8, 10, 12, 16 hours on a trolley in the emergency department. And that's unacceptable, it's undignified, and we need to do better.
Today it was revealed that 2 patients died at Worcester Royal Hospital waiting for hours on trolleys. One from an aneurysm, the other a cardiac arrest, though the Trust says there's no evidence of a link to winter pressures. And in Wales, ambulances were seen queuing outside this hospital in Cardiff, with several trusts asking people to avoid using A&E if they can. NHS England is telling me tonight that hospitals like this one are stretched but stable, that they're coping. They say beds weren't actually as full this Christmas as last year, and that their winter plan is tried and tested. But tested is exactly how many hospitals are currently feeling. And at the Royal Lancaster, they say the pressure isn't just down to the numbers coming in, but the numbers they can't get back out.
I think we've seen an increase in patients who are fit enough to go home, but who we can't send home because there isn't a place for them either in a nursing home or residential care home, or they haven't got the resources at home to manage. That's been increasing over the last few years.
The Red Cross says the problem's becoming a humanitarian crisis and has been called in to help at other hospitals. So wherever you are this winter, the chances are you'll face a long wait at your local A&E, and that's if you're not sent to wait elsewhere. Paul Brand, News at 10.
I've been